So Theresa May was in France last night giving a joint press conference with President Emmanuel Macron. It was hardly reported over here. I think the only channel that broadcast it live was Al Jazeera, as far as I could tell. And the morning news on the radio, BBC Radio News this morning, on the whole of the 3-hour Today programme, the main BBC Radio News programme, the only time it was mentioned was during the 5-minute religious slot, Thought for the Day. But this was major news. This was Theresa May's first public policy announcement since the election. And it wasn't about Brexit, although that was ostensibly the reason the election was called. It wasn't about austerity, even though a couple of days ago she'd said to her own backbenchers apparently that austerity was over, given their electoral defeat. It wasn't about any of those things. Her first public policy announcement was effectively to announce the end of internet freedom. What they actually announced was that internet companies would face heavy fines if they failed to remove what was loosely defined as extremist content. Now you might think, okay, well maybe they're referring to things like ISIS recruitment videos or suicide bomber training videos or whatever. But these things are already illegal, because it's already illegal to actually directly incite violence. So who exactly is being targeted here? What exactly is this about? Well, David Cameron first introduced the idea of criminalising what he called non-violent extremism a couple of years back. He thought this should be criminalised alongside, already criminalised obviously, violent extremism. And in an article he wrote for The Telegraph a couple of years back, he gave us an example of the kind of things that qualified as this kind of extremism. The idea that, quote, the West is bad. That was an example, as a direct quote of an example of an idea he said qualifies an extremist idea that should basically be censored. Another example he gave in another speech was, he said, the idea that the promotion of, quote, wild conspiracy theories. Well, the idea that British intelligence is colluding with Al-Qaeda sounds like a wild conspiracy theory, but actually in the context of Britain and Al-Qaeda's shared enemies in the form of Gaddafi and Assad, this is collusion that we know actually took place. MI5 facilitated the flow of fighters between Britain, Syria and Libya. MI6 equipped them, and they were trained by the SAS. This is known, and this was not even hidden as recently as 2015 in the UK Parliament. David Cameron publicly announced he was going to send another 400 British troops to train 5,000 Syrian fighters that even the BBC News admitted were likely to be allied to Al-Qaeda. So is this the kind of information that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and so on are going to be fined for publishing now, on the grounds that it's the kind of, quote, wild conspiracy theory that Cameron believes it demonstrates extremism? Well, you can see the urgency for the Tories behind this latest crackdown on the internet. You can see that coming out of this election we've just had. Because this election they just had, they completely lost control of the narrative. If you look, everyone was expecting, everyone was predicting a complete Labour wipeout, the biggest disaster since the 1983 election and so on. But times have changed since 1983. In 1983, basically everyone got their political information from the newspapers or from the BBC. BBC is controlled by the British state, and the newspapers are effectively controlled by 4 or 5 press barons, millionaires, Tory supporting press barons. So what that meant is when the Labour leader Michael Foot made a little stumble, that was videoed and replayed all over the place, and the image of Michael Foot, the Labour leader, as a bumbling oaf became the single abiding image of Labour in 1983. And that's because the narrative was controlled by this tiny handful of Tory millionaires. Fast forward today, that's completely not the case. The TV, the newspapers threw everything they could at Jeremy Corbyn, that he's a terrorist-supporting, magic money tree-mongering, Brexit-frustrating Romaniac. But it didn't wash. People weren't buying. And why weren't they buying? Because they weren't reading those newspapers, and they weren't watching those TV channels. They're getting their information from social media. And social media, the narrative is not controlled by the Conservatives. There's no monopoly control over the information that's out there. just to give you an example, an interview I myself did about the issue of British collusion with Al-Qaeda type death squads got 1.5 million views. Now, to put that in context, that's higher than the circulation of the Daily Mail. Jonathan Pye, who made an excellent video laying into the Conservatives' nonsense strong and stable slogan, that got 11 million views. Now that's higher than the combined circulation of the top 10 British newspapers combined. It's actually several million higher. And best of all, check this out, I went onto YouTube a couple of weeks before the election to watch a speech made by Theresa May. Watched the speech. When it got to the end, YouTube automatically played the song Liar Liar about Theresa May. And I imagine, because of the algorithms and how YouTube works and so on, I imagine that every time anyone watched anything about Theresa May, they got the song Liar Liar immediately afterwards. Very fitting follow-up. So you can see why the Tories are screwing about internet freedom. This is not what they want. The Conservative Party and the British state more generally have completely lost control of the narrative. So this new crackdown on internet freedom, this is what it's really about. It's about regaining control of the narrative. It's about trying to make the CEOs of Facebook and Twitter and Google into the Rupert Murdochs of the 21st century. The political allies and mouthpieces of the British ruling class and state. That's what it's really about. It's very dangerous and it must be resisted.